This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Maura, Donley, your host for today. Our usual host, Charlie, is on assignment, and he'll be back with us soon. But I'm really very fortunate to have with us Dave Atkinson, an associate of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're looking forward to our discussion today with another Dave, Mr. Dave Sanko. Welcome, Dave.
Hi.
Dave is the executive director of the Pennsylvania State Township Supervisors Association, and we're grateful to have you back with us today. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
So we have the General Assembly back in session. What sort of issues are you looking at this fall and heading into the spring?
Well, I think as they left town for
Heading
the
into the
summer,
winter.
Heading into the winter. Well, spring is after that.
I skipped an entire
It'll
season.
be budget season, but we'll get there. I think there were a couple things that were left unfinished before the summer break. One is a radar for local police. There's some additional changes to the amendments to the right to know law that will make it a little more cost effective. I think if they'll have to address some of the issues from SR 6 Commission, the Fire and Emergency Services. And I know that the governor wants to talk about Restore Pennsylvania, and that will bring on a discussion about broadband.
Remind us what Restore Pennsylvania is. That's the infrastructure plan that the governor's got going?
Restore Pennsylvania is the governor's proposed infrastructure plan that talks about from broadband to roads and bridges and water and sewer and blight and something for everyone, but a lot of infrastructure that has in many cases been neglected.
Do you think that's going to get passed this fall?
I think there's going to be some serious discussion about it. I don't know anybody who thinks that any of those infrastructure spending ideas are bad ideas, and they're all necessary. I think the devil is always in the details, and the question is how are you going to pay for it?
Yep. That is the issue with Restore PA,
yes,
as I understand
and it's always been the argument. Not only is there community support for the various kinds of infrastructure, but they're all carrying reports that indicate how far behind Pennsylvania is.
How important it would be.
But the mention of broadband is interesting because people understand the roads and bridges. They know when there's problems there. They see what's happening with their water and sewer bills. They understand that's part of the mix. Anyone that lives in any size community understands that there are derelict properties that you have to attend to. But then they hear broadband and they say, wait a minute, I got my cable, I got all my kind of stuff. What's the problem? And so tell us a little bit about all the difficulties that the lack of access has for small communities in rural areas of Pennsylvania.
Sure. Well, I think, as the 30s were kind of a time when you talked about building out the electric grid, in the 70s, or I'm sorry, the 50s, when you talked about building out the interstate system, and today broadband is the superhighway, the information superhighway of the 21st century. It's necessary from an economic development standpoint, an educational standpoint, a healthcare standpoint, and communities that don't have service are leaving. People are being left behind. Kids are being left behind. Businesses are left behind, and they're all over Pennsylvania.
Let me stop you there 1 second. We still have communities in Pennsylvania who have no internet access. Is that correct?
There are, according to the governor's numbers, 800,000 Pennsylvanians who have absolutely zero access. A recent Penn State study says that if you use the FCC standards for speed for uploads and downloads as 25 and 3, that not a single county in Pennsylvania meets the definition of having enough speed or enough capacity. But yes, there are people who don't have any, and then everybody else doesn't have enough.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Yeah. And so I guess we think about medicine, for example, where technology's become very important. But how about agriculture? It's not the
that's our number one industry,
the mule and the
correct?
plow and the 40 acres anymore.
There is not an industry or piece of Pennsylvania that is untouched by this the need for technology. There are cows that wear Fitbits that they can actually diagnose and track things to help produce or increase their productivity. The planning, the harvesting, all can be enhanced with computer access and help.
So what can be done? What will be done? What should
Well,
be done?
Well, I think that there's probably not as I'm kind of prone to say, not a one-size-fits-all technology. Fiber is going to be, there's a lot of ways you can get broadband to communities. There can be hard cable, there can be fiber, there can be satellite, which is pretty expensive. There is wireless, and in a state like Pennsylvania, with the diversity of our geography and geology, one thing isn't going to work everywhere. There are places where a straight sight line will work, and there's other places where you're down in a valley and you're going to have to bounce it off a satellite somewhere. So it's a blended solution, and it requires both the industry to step up, but also the state, the government regulators, state, federal, and local, to help recognize that residents need this and wanted it. And it's not just for gaming or to be able to see who's at your door with a video doorbell when you're at the mall. This is for kids to be able to do their homework. It's for telemedicine. You can on your phone call your doctor and they can diagnose you with the video call.
Small businesses must be crazy for this.
Small businesses, it'd be very helpful. A lot of home-based businesses. I read a story the other day of a lady in central Pennsylvania, a little bit north of State College, who was trying to download a computer software program to be able to do her bookkeeping and accounting. It took 33 hours.
That's just awful. Yeah.
So kids have to be able to do their homework. It's not uncommon to see parking lots in rural Pennsylvania, high school parking lots filled with cars in the evening because parents are sitting there with the kids being able to access the hot spots. They're sitting in the sheet stores and the Turkey Hills and the convenience stores and the restaurants, the fast food restaurants, because they're hotspot accesses.
So one of the elements of Restore PA would actually focus on the broadband issue.
There are 11 buckets within Restore PA. That is one, and I think the governor's on the right track by saying it's the biggest one, and I think clearly the most important one, the one that Pennsylvania will help move Pennsylvania forward fastest, most, and whatever Restore PA winds up being, I would hope that at least half of it goes to broadband.
Yeah. Every time we talk about townships, we're always talking about budget, and one of the things that comes into play is the whole question of state police coverage, and that argument has been going on for years and years and years. But the concentration, legitimate concentration now on public safety in terms of all the violent events, shootings, and everything, has that complicated the situation for township supervisors?
Well, I think that, look, we're in September here. It's National Preparedness Month. It's a month dedicated to public safety personnel. And whether they're what I call them the red, white, and blue line of defense, whether they're fire, police, or EMS, those are people that we need in our lives and we need in society who help make us safer when bad things happen. They respond. But every community has different needs and different levels of required needs. You can be in rural Pennsylvania and you're completely happy with a half-hour response time when the state police comes because there's not a lot of crime there. If you're so the current system allows you to have, if you're in a community that you want to have more police coverage, you can have more police coverage. You can put on a local police department. If you don't want to have more police coverage, you don't have to have police coverage. So it becomes a local choice based on what the community views as the threat, and what comfort levels they want to have.
So, what would you say is the primary reason why a lot of local communities don't have their own police department?
I think it's one of two things. One is that they're safe. And they don't feel like they need to spend the money on that.
It's not a priority
It's a limited
spending item.
It's a limited. They have limited resources. They don't need to spend the money on it. And two, and what helps drive them to that is that it is outrageously expensive because of some of the state mandates that go along with it.
Oh.
Are we making some headway in terms of retaining and attracting emergency responders? Because that, again, that's an issue where there's been a lot of discussion. There's been some legislation passed. I know there's more in the hopper that folks would like to see. But in terms of the numbers and what your members are relating to you, are we making some progress?
We're struggling. I think all of Pennsylvania is struggling. We are seeing both fire, police, and EMS have less and less interest. I mean, some of those are volunteer activities, and we've seeing those numbers drop. But even within the police world, recruiting is becoming tougher. The state police is having a hard time keeping up. There's a societal disrespect aimed at police that make it unattractive. But at the end of the day, the good news is when bad things happen, good people do step up, and those special folks run in when there's a burning building instead of running out like we would do. So I think the legislature is moving on some incentives to help make it more attractive for those responders, whether they be tax credits or tuition programs, things that will help recognize that volunteers are a necessary part of that public safety network.
So one of the big issues coming up in 2020 is the census. We've been hearing a lot about it. There's been talk about adding questions, deleting questions, but why overall should people participate in the 2020 census?
Well, I think look, for hundreds of years, every 10 years the government goes through and counts how many people there are. And you do that for primarily two reasons. To make sure that there is adequate representation and that you can then reapportion either state house or state senate or congressional districts so that you have as close to one man, one vote model as you can get with that representation. But secondly, and probably more importantly, is that's the way federal and state money is allocated to communities. So for every person who is not counted, it will cost Pennsylvania $2,200 in federal funds of some sort, be it money to help with broadband or money to help with transportation or money to help with schools.
And the reasons why they're not counted are probably things that would draw money. I mean,
they are. Interestingly, this is the first year in America's history that you can answer the census online. So that there is a technology advantage to that. But with 800,000 people living in rural Pennsylvania that don't have broadband, I'm going to suggest to you there's 800,000 people that are going to have a tough time getting counted.
Yeah. Wow.
Is it secure against being hacked?
And then you have the second security, the whole security question as to how you do that. I mean, we saw a story of a guy in Philadelphia who lives with he has 8 roommates, and they don't know who's going to fill it out. Which of the 8? All of the 8. Some of the 8. Does one person say there's 8 people, or does 8 people say there's 1, or do 8 people say there's 8 of us?
Yeah. Well, as always, when we have you, we run out of time. There's always so many issues to talk about. So we will definitely ask you back.
Okay.
We love having you here. Thank you so much for
Thanks for the invite. You bet.
Thank you, Dave, for co-hosting. Thanks so much. We'll be right back with the next segment of Behind the Headlines.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Behind the Headlines is also brought to you by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, helping hospitals provide healing, health, and hope to communities across the state. And by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. The Pennsylvania Chamber serves as the frontline advocate for business on Pennsylvania's Capitol Hill by influencing the legislative, regulatory, and judicial branches of state government. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Welcome back. In this segment, Dave and I are going to be joined by one of our old friends, Kevin Shivers, who is now the new president of the Pennsylvania Association of Community Bankers. Welcome.
Maura, thanks for having me. David, how are you, sir?
We have a specific issue we're going to talk about today, and that's cannabis. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you to let our viewers know a little bit about what the Association of Community Bankers is all about.
Sure. Community banks really are the spark plug of our Pennsylvania economy. If you think about it, in communities all across Pennsylvania, you have dry cleaners, laundromats, family farms. All of those business entities need to get funding to support their entrepreneurial dreams. Oftentimes, they're not large enough to be able to go to a big bank, a national bank, for funding. So these community banks, which are fund these loans using deposits by the residents in those communities. So literally, if you are a customer in a community bank, the investments you are making, the deposits you are making, are an investment in your community. In Pennsylvania, there are about 150 banks that are community banks that are chartered in the state. Our membership, we have about 100 of those banks within our membership. They're an important part of the community, of the economy overall. About half, little over half of all small business loans made in Pennsylvania are made through community banks. What's staggering about that is when you look at all of the asset sizes of all of the financial institutions, community banks in Pennsylvania make up only about 17% of the total assets. So when you think about just the incredible importance to small business and the small business economy on Main Street, community banks play that very important role.
Oh, well, you do have a big issue out there right now that we're going to talk about. I'm going to let Dave kick it off, and let's just talk about cannabis.
Well, I think that for people watching the show, the last thing that they expected somebody representing the community banks to talk about is cannabis.
And let's be clear,
yeah,
they're not advocating on behalf of cannabis.
Yeah, really this is a story about government regulation and compliance issues and the concerns that it's created. In the last several years, states like Pennsylvania have passed state-specific laws here in Pennsylvania, for example, to allow for medical cannabis. And policymakers have made a decision that there is medical efficacy to provide those types of drugs. We're not getting involved in that debate at all. But what's happened now is because at the federal level, these drugs are illegal, it prevents banks from actually doing business with those dispensaries or any of those companies that service those banks.
Because banking regulations are all on the federal level.
That's correct.
Mostly?
I mean, there are federal laws that say to banks, you cannot participate in illegal activity.
Right.
And that's a good thing, right? We don't want money laundering. We don't want to support human trafficking. We don't want mob activity, illegal gaming. And so the banks play an important role, community banks especially, in keeping our money supply safe. That's why when you open a checking account or you cash a really big check, it may take a day or two for you to get all of those funds back. That's because the banks are required to do a whole lot of due diligence to make sure that the monies that are received are not from illegal purposes. Here's where the problem lies, Maura, is that while medical cannabis is legal in Pennsylvania, it's illegal at the federal level. So that means that any funds that are used, transacted in this business cannot be banked. So if you have a medical cannabis card and you go to a dispensary, that's an all-cash transaction. That poses public safety threats for a couple of reasons. Number one, these are all cash businesses. And if you look at the history in Colorado, literally tens of thousands of dollars are being transacted every day. There were cannabis entrepreneurs who needed to hire armed guards to walk with them. This was like the old stagecoach days. Well, that leads to organized crime because you need protection.
They've been broken into and
That's
robbed
exactly right.
Yeah, because everyone knows it's an all-cash business now.
That's exactly right. Now, the other side to that is, again, under federal law, if you are involved in any type of illegal activity, even supporting it, then the banks are not supposed to help you. So in this instance, say you're a plumber and you fix a water line. You go out and you fix a water line at a dispensary. you are now engaged in supporting an
complicit.
illegal enterprise. You're complicit.
Wow.
And under the law, you shouldn't be allowed to have a checking account. You shouldn't be able to get an auto loan. You shouldn't be able to get a mortgage. And so that's where the real conflict becomes, because you have employees of these dispensaries who are lawfully hired under state law. They're lawfully, doing business. But because of the conflict with federal law, they're not able to open checking accounts. You don't get a paycheck. They are paid in cash, these employees. Right. Theoretically, the bank isn't allowed to take that cash as a deposit because it's from a nefarious purpose under federal law. But what if you want to buy a home? What if you need to take out a loan for your kids to go to college? All you're trying to do is support your family, but now just because of a conflict between state law and federal law, it's created all of this uncertainty. Now, for banks, they're regulated by a multitude of different agencies at the federal level and at the state level. And because the penalties for getting it wrong are so severe, because as a policy, as a nation, we don't want anything illegal into our money supply, many of these banks are erring on the side of caution. They don't want to do any type of business because the penalties are so severe. You could wind up shutting down your bank.
And well, from a small business perspective, this means they can't get credit cards, they can't do online bill pay, they can't do payroll. I mean, from a small business perspective, they're going to be so limited. I mean, it's
you're
kind of
absolutely
crazy.
and you're specifically talking about the dispensaries.
Right.
But what if you are a dispensary that is leasing space in a strip mall, right? And we have all these malls that are closing, and now many of them are moving to service-oriented facilities. So you're a strip mall owner, and you are leasing space to a dispensary. Technically, under federal law, the bank should call your mortgage on your entire strip mall because you are now complicit in an illegal enterprise. And the challenge that we face is you have all of these different agencies and you have all these different regulators. Mm-hmm. And so because there's no single consistent standard that's being used to enforce these laws, you could have one regulator who decides to prejudice one institution where a competitor bank who is in a different part of the state may not have that same regulator. What are the kinds of things that they can do? Well, those regulators could threaten your deposit limits. They might require you to have fewer deposits. You might need more, there may be more paperwork that you need to fill out for loans. They might even limit the kinds and the amounts of loans that you're able to deliver. So there's lots of pressure that can be brought to bear on an institution. And remember, these are community banks. Many of them have 14, 15, 20 employees in their local community. So you can imagine the type of impact that type of confusion can have in just trying to carry out business.
You've explained why bankers are generally seen as being fairly conservative folks in handling their money and their loans, their investments. Do you have members saying, geez, we see these stores opening up and they're dispensing all kind of products, they're marketing these products. Haven't we had the business side of things get ahead of the medical research and ahead of the government quality control that we often get through
David,
regulation?
you're absolutely right. There has been an explosion within this industry, and oftentimes this happens where an idea gets ahead of the regulators. All of a sudden you have an entrepreneur that comes up with an idea. We haven't figured out how to regulate that, how to control it, how to safeguard it. For about the last 15 years, all around the country, we have been seeing some iterations of cannabis laws being enacted in places. But when those laws are enacted, obviously there are people that are wanting to go out there and invest and to grow them. You want to be in at the ground floor, right? Because it just makes sense. You're building a marketplace, your market share.
So for those folks that are in those businesses, being first is a good thing. But when you're a bank, being first to the game is not really the most advantageous place, because we don't know how it's regulated. We don't know the enforcement mechanism. We haven't even figured out how to make sure that it's compliant, right? Because at the federal level, it's illegal. And so that is the biggest challenge that banks are bringing to federal lawmakers, is that we need to create some consistent standards so that in states where this activity is legal, not everywhere, but in states where this activity is legal, that there can be standards put in place so that the regulators will treat all of those financial institutions consistently, and we won't have the challenges that we face right now, where if you are working for a dispensary or you are doing business with a dispensary, that isn't jeopardizing your home mortgage, it's not jeopardizing your ability to get a college loan, it's not jeopardizing, your ability to live your life.
So before we run out of time, there's legislation on the federal level to address a lot of this. I
Yes.
assume you're advocating in support of that?
We spent all August, our members, in town hall meetings with our federal representatives to support the Safe Banking Act, and it's H.R. 1595 in Washington. There's movement on the bill. The bill has, the resolution has passed a committee, so that's the first hurdle at the federal
big.
level. And there was recently a public hearing held in the U.S. Senate to deal with this issue. Again, there are 33 states that are doing some type of cannabis activity. So the challenges that we're facing, as David alluded to, the regulators need to get ahead of that. So we're hopeful that through education opportunities, meeting with members of Congress, the public getting involved, that we can create some standards. Again, this is not about advocating for medical marijuana or recreational marijuana. All we're saying is, let's keep our money supply safe. Let's keep our communities safe. We don't want businesses where there's literally tens of thousands of dollars transacted on a daily basis, and you have people that have to hire armed guards to walk with them to keep them safe and our communities safe.
Well, it sounds like we are going to have you back so you can update us on what's happening on the federal level and in Pennsylvania. But we want to thank you so much for being here today.
Really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Join us next time on Behind the Headlines.